Hey everybody, this is Mr. Lamond, and we're breaking down World History, Unit 11, 11.3. We're talking about how did the war change over time. World War One, we talked about kind of how kind of easy it is to see the causes and to see the way the war began, mania, and you were able to write your essay and show just kind of very simply how each one of these things, imperialism and militarism and nationalism and those alliances, all compounded to draw Europe into what we call the Great War. It's an easy kind of a quick topic to work through. The other big thing that we want to talk about when we talk about World War One is the way war changed. It, the Industrial Revolution changed the economy of the world. People working in factories, people living in cities, mass production, assembly lines, changed everything. The way how much food people had, where they worked, where they lived. Well, if it had that big of an impact on people in terms of how they lived, where they lived, what they did, it's also going to have that big of an impact on the war. And there's going to be all these spillover effects as a result. It's like a snowball. Each one causes something else to happen. So we're going to discuss how the war changed over time. Now, here's probably the best way to set up your outline. Break it into three parts. The first thing we're going to talk about is industry changes military technology. We're going to talk about examples of this new military technology. Then, military technology is going to change warfare. We're going to talk about a specific example of this with trench warfare. And then we're also going to talk about what we refer to as kind of some new rules, some ways that the war changed in terms of how people see what's right and what's wrong in war. And then Roman numeral three, new warfare changes the world. So we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution, the U.S. entering the war, and then how the war ended. And just as a kind of a quick preview for Roman numeral three here, everybody, all historians basically say the number one cause of World War II was the way World War I ended. And we'll get to that here shortly. So let's break into a little bit of industry. And probably the best way for you to understand that industry changed military technology is when World War I starts in 1914, you have cavalry charges with swords, sabers. When the war ends in 1918, people are going into the war with tanks and machine guns. Okay, so we start the war with horses, we finish the war with tanks. That gives you a sense for how much was changed because of industry. We got a lot of firsts here. We'll just go from top left and work clockwise around the screen here. First up, and most importantly, without question, was the use of machine guns. If you remembered warfare in the old times, you lined up shoulder to shoulder, you marched across the field, you had bayonets perhaps, and if someone would shoot, then you have to take time to reload. They weren't very accurate, those muskets. And then as they learned to rifle the bullets, the bullets now came out spiraling, and they could be a little more accurate, but it still took a while to shoot. And as a result of the time that it would take to unleash a volley, which is a group of people shooting, to unleash volley after volley after volley, made it that you could perhaps charge across an open field and engage the enemy before they knock too many of your numbers out. Well, that goes out the window with the machine gun. Emphasis on the word machine. I mean, we're talking about industry changing military technology. They called it a machine gun. You could just push down the trigger and you don't even need to aim hardly. You could close your eyes and you just where it used to be bang, 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 bang. Right, that was 5 bullets. Now it's I can't count that fast. What is that? 10 bullets? Okay, every half a second, every second. And so charging across an open field, shoulder to shoulder, in lines, that's gone. Okay, the machine gun changed warfare in World War I more than any other weapon. Absolutely the most important. It wiped out troops by the thousands. All right, the next two, airplanes and tanks. We're going to talk about them both very similarly. Okay, they were both introduced in World War One. They both had an impact in World War One, but nowhere near as big as their impact in World War Two. When we get to World War Two, airplanes are going to be everything. They rule the war. Bombers, fighters, etc. Tanks rule the ground. Maybe not quite as big of an impact as the airplane, but during World War One, they were both still experimental, so to speak. Early World War One tanks were too slow. They used up too much gas. They would run out of gas too quick. Their treads broke too easily. They'd get stuck in the mud. They would fall into the trenches. Just not super effective. Right at the end of the war, people started to make them and use them and kind of figured out and kind of get a balance. But for the most part, they were just introduced. Now, the key is, as we'll talk in a little bit, tanks were introduced because they were trying to figure out a solution to trench warfare. Talk about that shortly. Airplanes, however, did a little bit more. Pretty a serious lack of sophistication. The earliest duels in planes were pilots with pistols, aiming their pistols at each other. Pop, pop, pop. The earliest bombs were pilots dropping lit sticks of dynamite out the cockpit window. Now, as the war progressed, they began to learn a little bit more. They, eventually figured out how to put a machine gun on top of on a plane. They learned how to make bombers. But for the most part, your early planes were more than anything else just a way to gain evidence or observation. It was about analyzing information, going up and seeing troop movements and things of that nature. Now, there was a sort of a majesty, a chivalry for these pilots. People referred to them as the early knights of the air. Remember the Middle Ages? We talked about the knights, the super warriors in the feudalistic time period, and how they had this cult of chivalry, this code that enabled them to do the right thing at all times. Well, a lot of these early pilots had the same thing. There's plentiful stories about, two pilots being up engaged in a dogfight, fighting each other, and then one of their guns jammed, and the other pilot says, "Oh, okay, well, we'll see you tomorrow. Get your gun fixed, and we'll pick this up where we left off." A very kind of interesting view of war. All right, next down, you see some guys with masks walking through a cloud of gas. This is mustard gas, chlorine gas, chemical weapons. And where do you get chemical weapons? You get them from industry. Industry was figuring out how to launch via artillery a shell or a canister that would have poison gas in it. It might blind you, it might choke you. They were not all fatal, but most were. We're going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the rules of war. But it was a first in warfare to use chemical weapons. Now, ironically, the first time it was used was by some Germans lobbed towards some Canadians. They shoot the gas over towards the enemy lines. The Canadians don't have any masks, of course, because nobody knew this was coming. So hundreds died. But it kind of went against the Germans when a wind came up and blew the gas right back in their faces. So it wasn't kind of a back and forth in terms of how effective it was. Bottom right, super effective, super important in World War One and World War Two. These are submarines, mostly held by the Germans. The British Navy was much too cool to slip underneath the water and sneak up attack on people. And we'll talk a little bit more about the sneak attack part of it shortly. But the Germans had no such apprehension about going under the water. And so they built lots of these U-boats. They referred to them as wolf packs, hunting, prowling in the North Atlantic. And they were very effective at slowing and almost stopping the influx of cargo vessels that the Allies, the French, the British, the Russians, needed in order to stay supplied. We'll talk about the fact that a lot of their supplies came from the United States, but you know, the food, the iron, the steel, the bullets, the gunpowder, everything they needed to ship in. And the Germans' U-boats were really good at sinking these cargo ships to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So much so that they came very close to winning the war based on the U-boats. And last but not least, you see this super cannon, right? These huge artillery um, firing howitzers, cannons, etc. They could shoot shells that weighed upwards of 200 pounds. Think about a 200-pound shell, and they could shoot them upwards to 5 to 6 miles. So you could destroy a city and not see it. That's part of the reason they used the airplane, so you could spot these things. But the destruction of cities, the destruction of railroads, the destruction of your line of battle by these long-range howitzer artilleries was going to be very important as well. So that's our industry changes military technology. Now let's start to talk about how um, military technology changes warfare. The first response to all of this new military technology was trench warfare. Now, trench warfare is not new. It's just you simply dig a line in the ground so you can hide down in there like a foxhole, so you can hide in there so you don't get shot, you don't get blown up. See these guys? You know that you're not spending a lot of time digging a trench like this. You're just digging it as tall as a man and as wide as a person. And that's it. You would just stay right there so that you couldn't hit by a machine gun or artillery shells. Well, what everybody expected to happen in World War One is the armies would clash in the field, the best army would overrun the other army, and then we'd figure out who the winner would be. But machine guns made that impossible. I didn't talk about barbed wire, but barbed wire becomes part of this. But basically, what happens is neither side is able to charge the other side effectively and run them off the field. You know, y'all ever play that game Red Rover, Red Rover? You hold hands and you, Red Rover, send Johnny on over. Johnny runs over, and if he can run through two people holding hands, then he can um, take people back to his team and kind of go back and forth trying to run through each other's lines. Coincidentally, the strongest point on a Red Rover line, does anybody know? Two girls holding hands because girls don't want to be separated. Weakest point where a boy and a girl are holding hands because you know the boy is like, oh my gosh, I don't want to have to touch a girl. It's like a fourth grade game, you know. All right, so anyways, that's enough Red Rover for now. But trenches, they couldn't beat the trenches. They couldn't get through from one side to the other. They kept just getting stuck. And this getting stuck, they refer to as a keyword here, stalemate. Stalemate is when nobody wins. Okay. This area in between the trenches just became littered with dead bodies, craters from artillery shells, barbed wire, and it became a death zone, so much so that they referred to it as no man's land. And in between the trenches, in no man's land, no man could go. If you saw War Horse or Wonder Woman, you know, there's these scenes where these people try and charge across the open field and they just get obliterated. Machine guns and etc., shells. And basically what happens is for about a 4-year period, Europe sits along these trenches and they're stuck in a stalemate. On this map, you can see right here, this little red line between France and Germany. And basically this little spot right here where you can see the mouse going up and down, for about 3 years, that's where they fought back and forth over about a 50-mile stretch north to south and about 5 miles wide. So basically think of World War One being from Tampa to Orlando and from as far south as, you know, the South Mall, I don't know what they call it in Lakeland, but the other mall, and as far north as Lake Gibson High School. And they just fought back and forth over this because they could not figure out how to break out against this new technology. The technology had basically caused a stalemate. Now, these trenches were terrible places to live. Muddy, wet. You got what's called trench foot, where your foot is stuck in the water all day long, and it just, the skin starts to rot off. It's freezing cold. You deal with frostbite. There's rats, fleas, lice. You're getting all kinds of sicknesses, typhoid, dysentery, diarrhea. Most deaths in World War One were related to disease in the trenches. How bad they were to live in. And so the first response to military technology is they didn't know what else to do. So they just dug trenches and waited and waited and waited. Now, they also started to use some of these technologies to break the stalemate. Again, that's why they first invented tanks, to try and drive through the trenches. That's why they invented um, the mustard gas, the chlorine gas, to try and chase people out of the trenches. Now, the other thing we want to talk about is the way it changed the rules. Before we do that, here's some pictures of one of the bloodiest battles of the war. If you want to get some more intel on just how rough and awful these battles were, just look up the Somme. It was a battle where the British thought, okay, we'll just shoot artillery shell after artillery shell at the Germans. We'll, bomb them into submission, and then we'll just walk across no man's land and get rid of them. Well, as you can see, that didn't work very well. Bloody, awful battle, etc. Okay, so the second half of Roman numeral 2 is the way warfare changes the rules. Now, we're going to talk about this in 3 groups. We're going to do U-boats, poison gas, and targeting cities. So the first one, U-boats. Okay, how does a submarine sink another ship? Think about it for a second. You sneak up, you shoot a torpedo into the side of the boat, and then you sail away. You don't ever want to be seen. A submarine that is not below water is a sitting duck. They're slow. They don't have a lot of offensive capabilities. And so the only way a submarine can survive is a sneak attack. Now, we call sneak attacks cheap shots. If somebody walked up to somebody and punched them in the back of the head, we'd say that was a cheap shot. And we'd look down on them. We'd say, that wasn't right. That wasn't cool. Why'd you do that? What's your problem? Well, that's cheating. And the Germans were cheating. That's what U-boat warfare is. But remember we talked about the 2 powers, the 2 teams, and we said that, for the most part, the British Navy could supply them everything they needed. And if they have everything they need, guys, they're going to win the war. Well, if I'm Germany, how do I keep the British from getting what they need? I got to sink it. I got to sink those ships. I got to sink that Navy. And if I got to do it with a cheap shot, well, so be it. At one point, the world was starting to get angry. The United States was getting mad, especially. And the Germans came up with something they called the Sussex Pledge. Sussex, like subs. And basically the Sussex Pledge was, okay, we'll stop sinking boats without warning. We'll pull up to them, tell them we're going to sink them, give them a couple minutes to get on the lifeboats, then we'll sink them. Well, again, what did we say? That made it harder for the submarines to sink vessels. And so they did this for a while. They said, okay, we'll fight by the rules. And they fought by the rules, and they were losing, and it wasn't working. So they said, forget the rules. We're going to go back to doing it the way we used to. And we're going to talk here shortly about how this helped draw the United States into war. But it changed the rules. Okay? Cheap shots. Second, poison gas. I mean, it's one thing for me to shoot you with a bullet. It's another thing for me to throw gas at you and cause your lungs to melt or your eyes to, burn out. Look at this picture down here at the bottom. Here's one healthy soldier, and the rest of these guys are blinded because of the gas. I mean, look at this political cartoon, this propaganda poster. It's the devil going to the German Kaiser and basically saying, times are hard, Your Majesty. You leave us nothing else to do but to use poison gas. Look at the donkey here, got his gas mask. It was seen as a terrible way to die. I mean, you're choking to death. Your lungs are basically filling with fluid. It's almost as if you're drowning. It was not seen as a gentlemanly way of fighting a war. It was seen as dastardly, as evil, etc. And a lot of people are saying, you're not following the rules of war using this poison gas. Well, again, both sides used it, and both sides basically said, we don't have any other solution. Last but not least, we talk about the new New technology changing warfare was targeting cities. Okay. Look at this graph here on the map that shows the number of deaths. The darker the color, the higher the percentage of people who were killed. So if you go down here on the Ottomans, almost 15% of the population died in the war. If you go into Germany, almost 5% of the population died in the war. Okay, that's overall population. A lot of that is women and children. You can see here, this is a destroyed city. Well, who was in the cities? Soldiers? No, they're out in the trenches. Who are in the cities? Women and children, the elderly. Look at this picture here. What are these kids practicing? Putting on what? Gas masks. That tells you that some of the gas attacks were going into the cities. Since when is it inside the rules to target civilians in a war? But what these countries decided was cities have factories. Factories produce things that make war. Cities have civilians. Civilians deal with the morale of a country. If we can destroy the factories, and if we can destroy morale, we can win the war. And so cities become targets. Now, this wasn't quite as extensive as it's going to be in World War II. You're going to see in World War II, this was everything. The cities were destroyed by both sides recklessly. But we're just now having some of the technology to do it during World War I, and it became part of the new warfare. All right, so moving on to Roman numeral 3. 3 ways that the new warfare changed the world. First up, the Russian Revolution. Russia has been one of the longest running monarchies in the world history. The Romanovs have ruled since the 1600s when they threw out the Golden Horde, the Mongols. And this family has ruled Russia, but now you're going to have a Bolshevik, communist, industrial worker-led revolution led by Vladimir Lenin, and he's going to overthrow, and eventually they're going to kill Tsar Nicholas and all of his family, despite Rasputin's best efforts to lead them another way. But here's the thing. Remember why Germany, their number one disadvantage? They were surrounded. So their right hand is punching France and England, while their left hand is punching Russia. Well, Russia, in the midst of World War I, starts fighting itself. So now imagine Russia with its left hand punching Germany and its right hand punching their own face. Because that's where the revolution is. You fight your own people. So Germany struggling in the center. Left hand going one way, right hand going another. Now Russia is weaker because not only are they fighting Germany, they're fighting themselves. The Russian army was so poorly trained, poorly led, and had such a bad morale that at one point they set up 2 different lines of machine guns. One line of machine gun would be up on the front, aimed at the Germans. The other line of machine guns would be lined up behind their own lines to shoot their own men if they tried to run away from battle. If you're machine gunning your own men, you're not doing so well. And the Russians, basically, in the midst of this revolution, quit the war. They signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It sounds very Russian. Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And basically what it said was, we quit. We're out. You can see the Russians here, sitting at the table with the Germans here, and they leave. And they say, here, you can even take this land. We're tired of people getting killed. We're tired of dying. So you just take your stuff and leave. And they quit fighting. Uh-oh. Now we got a problem if you're an ally, because now instead of Germany being surrounded, now they can put all their attention into hitting England and France. And they start to do that. But right about as they start to do that, guess who joins the war? The United States. And the United States is going to join the war basically for 2 big reasons. First, U-boats. There were many American ships who were attacked and sunk by German U-boats. Probably the most famous was the Lusitania, which was actually a British passenger ship. Think like a Disney cruise. And the Germans sank it, killing over 1,000 people, including, as you can see in this propaganda poster, women and children. Now, the Americans were very angry at the Germans for sinking the Lusitania and killing all those civilians, and for sinking the, the ships, and for not following the Sussex Pledge, and for cheating, etc., etc. And so we were very angry and we wanted to go to war. The other reason we went to war is a very clumsy move by the Germans to try and get Mexico to join Germany and fight the United States. They sent them a telegram, the Zimmermann telegram. Zimmermann was the German ambassador, and basically said, hey, Mexico, remember how the United States stole Texas and Arizona from you guys? If you help us fight the United States, when we win, we'll give you guys Texas back. Well, the British stole the telegram and had it printed in American newspapers. And so America got really mad because Germany was trying to talk our neighbor into punching us in the back of the head. And so for those reasons, the United States entered the war. Well, we weren't like superpower at this time, but we had lots of people and lots of resources. And once we cranked up our industry and started getting some military technology going, we jumped into Europe. And, you know, for better or for worse, basically, everyone else was worn out, dead tired, fighting each other, Germany, England, France. We come in fresh, you know, like some tag team wrestling match, and we smash Germany with a chair, and the war ends. Now, how does the war end? Well, we have the Paris Peace Conference. And what do we know about the Paris Peace Conference? Here's your last big thing for 11.3. England and France were very angry at Germany. Because they were angry at Germany, they wanted to treat them harshly. Notice the tax in the chair. Clemenceau, the Frenchman, says to the German delegates, take your seats, gentlemen. They were very angry because they blamed the war on the Germans. Now, if we go back to causes, it's kind of hard to blame the Germans. You know, everyone was kind of involved in this. But yeah, they were very militaristic, but they wanted to punish them. And so they took their land, they took their money, it's called reparations, and they took a lot of their military, demilitarization. The Germans were humiliated at Paris. So that's a big, huge part of this. Because why later on is Adolf Hitler going to rise to power? Why are the Germans going to say, do anything you want, just make us Germany again? Well, because they're so humiliated from World War I. So that's first. Second, Woodrow Wilson, the United States president, tries very hard in the Treaty of Versailles to use his 14 points. Now, Wilson was an idealist, and he wanted to prevent another war, and that's what his 14 points were about. One of the 14 points was freedom of the seas. Let's stop having people rule the ocean. Another was, let's give all these little countries their independence. Remember nationalism? Another one was, let's stop taking colonies. Let's get rid of imperialism. And he had all these idealistic ways to get rid of war. However, probably the most important of his 14 points was the 14th. He wanted to start something called the League of Nations. And the League of Nations would put all the countries together as like a way to step into the gap anytime a problem occurred. So, you know, if Austria has their Archduke assassinated by Serbia, instead of going to war, well, you take it to the League of Nations. It's like Judge Judy. Judge Judy will listen and come up with some sort of, you know, compromise, or here's what we're going to do. And so the United States, under Woodrow Wilson, was said to be the key power to join the League of Nations. Well, guess what? What does it look like Uncle Sam decided to do? What do the American people decide about the League of Nations? You can tell we decided to sit on the sidelines. That'd be like Captain America not joining the Avengers. Yeah, I mean, you still got some Avengers, but without Captain America, it's not really the Avengers. And without the United States, we don't really have a League of Nations. So here's the key point as we wrap up how warfare changed the world. Instead of countries wanting to get back to normal and try and get along again, Germany was punished. And instead of countries trying to look to find a way to not have another world war, they basically set conditions that will cause another world war. And so that ties up the end with this last little bit. There was something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Kellogg-Briand. Kellogg-Briand Pact. All the nations of the world got together. And what was their solution to the Great War? The war that was nicknamed the War to End All Wars? In the Kellogg-Briand Pact, they outlawed war. They made it illegal to fight a war. I want you to think for a second. Is it possible to outlaw war? To tell countries they're not allowed to use war anymore? I mean, how do you stop them from using war? Pretty please? You tell their mommies? Do you not invite them to your party? What's the only way to stop a country from using war? You got to use war back at them. So is it practical to outlaw war in the Kellogg-Briand Pact? No. But that tells you how much warfare changed the world. That wraps up 11.3, the last PowerPoint lecture for world history this year. You made it.